This is Iron Hans, Restoration of Distorted Masculine Energy. So I want to thank you for inviting me to present on one of my favorite fairy tales, this one dealing with the more masculine yang aspects of the human psyche. And I see it as a complement to Cinderella that I presented on earlier this year that dealt with the feminine yin energies. I hope that those of you that were not in my Cinderella course had a chance to review it. One of the reasons I like teaching in China is that the lectures are recorded and become part of your teaching and training library, and it impels me and presenters like myself to prepare more thoroughly, knowing that the lectures are not just a one-off experience. And I post the lectures on my blog, and I have many viewers from countries with a Chinese-speaking people, so your Jungian reach extends far beyond China. So in the introduction to Cinderella, I commented on the importance of working with fairy tales as an excellent means of developing an archetypal and symbolic eye that can be applied to dream work, sand play therapy, and discerning deep dynamics in film, theater, and music. You have the translated article Tips on Dream Interpretation, and most of the techniques I use for interpreting dreams apply to analyzing fairy tales. I compared fairy tales with other archetypally rich material and presented several approaches for working with fairy tales, so please review the introduction to Cinderella if you have not done so. So in the Grimm's version of Cinderella, it was the masculine that was distorting the feminine, while in Grimm's Iron Hans, we will see how it's the feminine that distorted the masculine. Those of you familiar with my lectures know I like to illustrate my material as much as possible with my favorite book, the I Ching. I think of Cinderella as being associated with the trigram Ken, keeping still, the mountain shown on the left, where there is a yang line atop two yins. This can be imagined in its negative form as yang holding down, dominating, and suppressing yin energy, thereby distorting it, as we saw in Cinderella. Cinderella had to cultivate a deep connection to the archetypal feminine and embody it before she could attract masculine energy looking for new feminine energy, i.e., the prince looking for a bride in a kingdom without a queen. So the trigram I envisioned for Iron Hans is, and I'm not sure the Chinese pronunciation, Tui, the joyous, the lake shown on the right. In its negative form, the yin line at the top holds down, distorts the two strong yang masculine lines beneath it. We will see how this is symbolically presented in Iron Hans. The young prince in the tale must connect with and transmute yang energy distorted by being checked by the feminine before he can connect with an anima and restore balance in the kingdom. Apologies for the course description where I use the trigram Li instead of Tui for the trigram comparison between the two fairy tales. Second lecture at the 13th Sandplay Conference in China in November-December of 2022 illustrated with hexagrams in the dreams of a Western man how his intense psychoanalytic focus on his relationship with the anima culminated with the hexagram Li, the clinging fire. So the yin line between the two strong yang lines in the trigram Li makes them bright after the creative heaven on the left, the three yang lines, have incorporated the central line of the receptive earth on the right, the three yin lines, and that generates Li. So the marriage at the end of the Iron Hans could be depicted by this trigram with yin incorporated within two strong yang lines. This is the beauty of the balance and complementarity in Chinese philosophy. At least this is how a Westerner relates to your book of wisdom, the I Ching. So if it's way off balance, please tell me. So the process of this incorporation was depicted by the 1.5 years of analysis of the male analysand, where the dream messages were amplified, guided, and reinforced by hexagrams he received in the dreams, or hexagrams after being told in the dreams to consult the I Ching. In my 41 years of practicing as a Jungian analyst, I've never seen a case that so clearly illustrates the connection between hexagrams and dreams, leading to my belief that the source of our dreams is the same source for the hexagram answers from the I Ching. The Sandplay Conference lectures are recorded, and an extended version is available in English on my blog, January 25th, 2024. The blog is jungianecopsychology.com. A fascinating dimension of Iron Hans, it is that it was the archetypal base that American poet Robert Bly used to found a men's movement in America in the 1980s. Bly had noticed in his Jungian workshops in the 1980s what he called soft males partnered with strong, liberated women that emerged from the women's movement of the late 1960s. If there is a basic change in feminine energy, then masculine energy must change as well. Again, the idea of complementarity. I find it so intriguing that the men's movement was founded on a fairy tale. So I will be making frequent references to Bly's book, Iron John, a book about men that created quite a stir when it was published in 1980. The men's movement evolved over the decades to its present form called the Mankind Project. Its website describes itself, the project, as a training and educational organization, quote, hosting life-changing experiential personal development programs for men through a global network of free, peer-facilitated men's group. It supports and challenges men to, quote, find purpose, vulnerability, live honestly, and act with integrity. End of quote. And I have worked with men over the years who have been through the program and found it to indeed be life transforming. So what happened was that Bly was interviewed for a magazine called Psychology Today while he was writing his book. And I read the article about Iron John and I realized, oh, he only got halfway through describing what was in the book. So because of my Zurich training, I analyzed the fairy tale and then presented it at the Chicago Jung Institute before the book came out. And then after the book came out, I checked it out and we pretty much agreed on the interpretation. He went into more detail than I did on some parts. So I will be referring to his book and taking some of the nuggets out of it as we go through this fairy tale. So after the book came out, I did a men's group myself that had a lot of Native American rituals in it. And I just found it so meaningful to be with a group of men and discuss some of the principles that I will be presenting in this course. Let's take an in-depth Jungian dive into this fairy tale that opens with this paragraph. There was once upon a time a king who had a great forest near his palace, full of all kinds of wild animals. One day he sent out a huntsman to shoot him a roe, but he did not come back. Perhaps some accident had befallen him, said the king. And the next day he sent out 2 more huntsmen who were to search for him, but they too stayed away. Then on the 3rd day he sent for all his huntsmen and said, scour the whole forest through and don't come back until you've found all 3. But of these also none came home again, and of the pack of hounds which they had taken with him, none were seen again. From that time forth, no one would any longer venture into the forest, and it lay there in deep stillness and solitude, and nothing was seen of it, but sometimes an eagle or a hawk flying over it. This lasted for many years, when an unknown huntsman announced himself to the king as seeking a situation and offered to go into the dangerous forest. The king, however, would not give him consent and said, it's not safe in there. I feel it would fare with you no better than with the others, and you would never come out again. The huntsman replied, Lord, I will venture in at my own risk. of fear I know nothing. So we will employ our sensation function by paying attention to the details in the fairy tale and notice that there is no specific time frame. Once upon a time. This is a universal, timeless story, i.e., a basic construct and archetypal experience in the human psyche. Franz in German is John in English, a generic, i.e., a basic name for a male in the West. I suspect there's a name in Chinese for like a typical or generic male and a typical generic female. If you know that, could you tell me what it is?
Okay, I will ask them. Okay.
Okay. So in English, we would say like Johnny and Susie, John and Susan. That would be pretty typical male female names. So I presume you have that in Chinese as well.
那么在英语当中，我们会说 Johnny、Susie 或者 John、Susan，那么是比较常见的男性和女性的名字。那我想可能中文当中也会有，Yes, like Little Ming, Ming means bride, like Little Ming or Little
Mhm.
Red, or Little Ming, yeah, again, like John 3. John is the third name, John 3, John 3 Li 4, Little Ming, and also 建国 like the like construction of the country, and Little Red, 志刚 like like the well and strongness,
Mm.
and 小刚 like little strongness.
Yeah,
Aaron in somehow this gang also means Aaron.
I am so fascinated by the construction of Chinese words. If you could possibly type that up for me and send it to me, I absolutely love it. Okay, and a woman that I really connected with on the post-conference tour, we had pretty powerful experience together. And the next day she came and had a drawing for me. And then she wrote out her Chinese name and she told me all the elements to it and what it meant. And I was just fascinated by that. So with our basic tale about a man, then we look at the king, and there was no name given for the king, but so it's just purely the king as the archetype of ruler, dominant element, the power in a culture, seen in the past as God's representative and power on earth. He was associated with fertility of the land and the people of his domain, and was literally or symbolically removed if fertility suffered. The king represents what it is to be a man in a particular culture at a particular historical period. So the palace symbolizes ego development, what consciousness has wrestled from the energies of the unconscious that can be put under conscious management. A significant point is that the palace, the seat of authority, riches, and honor, is near, quote, a great forest full of all kinds of wild animals, end of quote. In sand play therapy, one derives meaning from the placement of the toys and their proximity to each other. Here, the seat of consciousness and power, which we associate with our ego, is in close proximity to a forest, a place of limited visibility, and things can be hidden. One can get lost. And this forest is full of, quote, all kinds of wild animals, end quote. The forest and wild animals psychologically represent the deeper levels of the collective unconscious, more associated with the body and the instinctual than with spirit and consciousness. I was surprised when I visited Beijing to see how close it was to the Great Wall. You know, instead of the capital being in the middle of the country, surrounded by maybe 1,000 miles from a wild area and negative forces, it was so close to that wall built to help protect it from those negative forces. Again, for those of you that do sand play therapy, just feel into the difference between like a castle or a home next to a forest with a lot of wild animals into it versus a castle or a home that may be quite a distance in the sand tray away from something associated with wild animals and a dark forest. Just you have to feel into that situation. And the same applies to when you're working with a dream. When somebody's telling a dream to me, I always try to imagine what the spatial arrangement is. And in the office I had in Madison, we had a big blackboard, and I was often have the analysand draw the arrangement of the characters and the buildings and so on. We get so much information by how things are spatially arranged. So the king initiates the movement in the tale by wanting something from the wild forest, a roe, a male deer. The Ad de Vries Symbol Dictionary, so useful for amplifying elements in Northern European fairy tales, notes that there are many associations of roe with Dionysus, the Greek god associated with vegetation, fertility, and especially male fertility. And as the god of winemaking, he relates to how wine eases suffering and can lead to ecstasy, release of inhibitions, and divine madness when imbibed in excess. So the king wants something from the wild. He wants something to eat, something to nourish him that's associated with the wild. That's what wanting a roe would symbolize. So we see from the fairy tales how frightening it can be, how threatening it can be just to tap into that dimension. Symbolized here by, oh, I just won a deer for supper. But that's tapping into that realm, and what do you know? Bad things can happen just by touching it. And that's where, on the other hand, that's why Dionysus is associated kind of with the roe, in that if you drink a lot of wine, it loosens up inhibitions and structures. So here we have a palace, pretty structured, next to this wild forest. So again, that important connection between wine and ecstasy, loosening inhibitions, and the threats that can be released by doing that. Given that my name is Dennis, it is related to Dionysus, so I've had to think about what Dionysus means in Western culture. So, as I mentioned in the Cinderella lectures, any element in a dream or fairy tales can have many associations, like the mirrors on the surface of this disco ball. For example, the roe, other associations to it include gentleness and being an emblem of Christ, of love, wisdom, and foresight. And you think of those associations as the mirror, like I said, and ball, and then you choose the associations from each disco ball that contribute to an emerging storyline for the dream or fairy tale. And that storyline is like the string that connects all of the relevant associations on the individual elements, the disco ball, into a necklace. And again, in working with dreams and fairy tales, it's important to remember that every element qualifies everything else, and there are no random elements in there. They are all a particulate kind of symbiotic relationships with the other elements. And for this disco ball here, for example, let's say all of those yellow and orange associations relate to a developing storyline about masculine energy, or maybe distorted masculine energy. So we pick those, and how does that fit with another disco ball whose particular elements would fit in with the storyline? And those are the elements, the associations that you work with. So I've been working with dreams for 50 years now, 41 years professionally. And the longer you do that, the more you realize that every element in there is not randomly in a dream or a fairy tale. It has a very specific and qualifying place. You just have confidence from experience that of the importance of the particulars and the individual elements. So the huntsman knows the ways of the animals and the wilds. And for them to go missing, plus, quote, the pack of hounds, end of quote, the human animal link to the deeper side of nature means that the vital link to the natural as body, the unconscious, and nature itself had been severed. So this is our first dynamic of 1, 2, 3 times that something is done that leads to a denouement, a change to something different as the fourth. The fourth here being the cutoff from everything implied by a great forest full of all kinds of wild animals. 3 is a dynamic masculine number associated with movement and time, mostly as the inexorable unilateral movement of life, like the lines as steps in hexagram 1 that create it. One can imagine the closed-off forest as the repression of unconscious energy associated with a complex. So we get a hint about the nature of the complex by the type of birds flying above the off-limits forest. In fairy tales, as in dreams, I mentioned every element qualifies every other one. And many of the associations for the ego are power, male fertility and activity, and the gods of power and war. It's an attribute of Zeus in Greece and Odin in Teutonic mythology. Remember that the qualifiers now about what is in the forest and what makes it so dangerous has something to do with eagles and hawks. The hawk and the eagle are qualifying what kind of deadly energy is in that forest. It's whatever we associate with hawk and eagle are associated with whatever is deadly in that forest. Said that the hawk, like the eagle, is related to the fire, sun, and nobility. And a spoiler alert, at the end of the tale, we'll see what is distorted hawk and eagle energy, if you will, is really something that in its positive form is related to the nobility and sun and consciousness. I love this image of the red-tailed hawk. It's the kind of hawk we have here in Wisconsin, and it's the spirit animal of one of my dear friends. So the royal hawk is sacred to solar gods and goddesses, like Horus, Ra, and the Sphinx of Egyptian mythology. It was also sacred to Apollo, and it was his messenger. So eagles and hawks are birds of prey, and they're noted for their ferocity and brute force and violence, and the opposite of the weak songstresses like the nightingale. So the forest was off limits for many years, which can represent the lifetime of an individual, a prolonged period for a family or a couple or a culture, or an age in history. This is how the archetype of time is presented in the I Ching, as described in my Seasons of the Soul video that has been translated into Chinese. So the huntsman that showed up after many years was unknown, meaning he was from outside the reigning power structure of the culture that was cut off from its forest and its animal side. This would be the dynamics of the self coming from a holistic source to move an individual or a culture beyond a stuck point. So the huntsman functions as the archetype of the hero that we see in the daring people like poets, writers, movie makers, and the youth that plunge in and shake things up to instigate change. To instigate change, to move out of the hexagram 12 standstill stagnation where we have heaven, the upper trigram, and the earth, lower trigram, move out of relationship to each other that generates standstill. As a huntsman in our tale, his fearless activities are with regard to nature, which has turned deadly in the vegetative, wild, and animal realms of the human psyche. So we could think of this hexagram in a way. The 3 top lines would be like the king's castle, and the 3 bottom lines would be like the wild forest. And when you have the spiritual energy like above and moving away from the body and the instinct, that's when you get standstill. I just love this beautiful abstract presentation of that principle with this hexagram standstill. So what a surprise we have in store in paragraph 2. The huntsman therefore betook himself with his own dog to the forest. It was not long before the dog fell in with some game on the way and wanted to pursue it, but hardly had the dog run 2 steps when it stood before a deep pool, could go no further, and a naked arm stretched itself out of the water, seized it, and drew it under. When the huntsman saw that, he went back and fetched 3 men to come with buckets and bail out the water. When they could see to the bottom, there lay a man whose body was brown like rusty iron, and whose hair hung over his face down to his knees. They bound him with cords and led him away to the castle. There was a great astonishment over the wild man. The king, however, had him put in an iron cage in the courtyard and forbade the door to be opened by pain of death. And the queen herself was to take the key into her keeping. And from that time forth, everyone could once again go into the forest with safety. So notice how quickly the deadly energy was encountered upon entering the forest or the unconscious. The dog had gone but 2 steps before it could go no further because of a deep pool when an arm reached out and dragged it under. An arm represents power and activity, and De Vries says, "Hast thou an arm like God?" which is from the Bible, Job chapter 40, verse 9. And being pulled underwater in Jungian terms would be an abasement de niveau mental, a lowering of the mental level, being seized by a complex or worse. So the huntsman did what a good Jungian analysis does. It engages the fearful energy with the hopes of getting an image that can be worked with. Fear, depression, anxiety, those are nebulous terms, but images are precise expressions of the issue. Fetching 3 men with buckets is a directed activity, there's a threeness again, and not a fearful fleeing from the problem. Bailing out the water 1 bucket at a time is that slow step-by-step process in therapy where one engages the unconscious at deeper and deeper levels to get to the source of the problem, to raise it to consciousness and have a clear image and feeling for the situation, because feelings are associated with every element in a dream and in a fairy tale. Notice that it was the dog that was pulled in, not the man. So the dog would be like the more instinctual side or intuitive side that connected more directly to the animal realm, if you will, than our human consciousness. So hair is associated with primitive instinctual animal power. And the strong man, like Samson in the Old Testament of the Bible, had long hair and magical powers. And the wild man Enkidu from the ancient Sumerian Gilgamesh epic had wavy hair like the goddess of corn and matted hair like the god of cattle. To say it more plainly, what is so deadly is distorted masculine power, distorted yang energy. Pan, the nature god in Greek mythology, had hairy legs, and that is related to the untamed, uncultured male energy, and it became the image for the devil in Christianity. And Jung was fond of pointing out one of the problems with Christianity is that it has demonized the body and sensuality and smell and sexuality, kind of the animal realm. And a perfect illustration is taking the God of nature from the Greeks and turning that into our Christian image of the devil. So Pliny said that iron, the color of the wild man's body, was the best and worst of ores. It can be used in agriculture for plowshares and scythes and for weapons of war. And iron is also associated with bondage and cruelty. Think of the iron cage here for that wild man was put in. And it is related to the Israelite period of enslavement in Egypt. And the rod of iron as an instrument of God is associated with punishment. Again, the qualifier, the particular of iron, the wild man was like rusty iron. So in its positive sense, this energy can be used for plowing, breaking up the earth, feeding humans and so on. In its negative sense, it's associated with the worst things that humans do is conduct warfare. We're talking about the Iron Age. Iron governs the planet Mars. Mars, Aries, Mars in Roman mythology, Aries in Greek. And Aries is associated with dawn, spring, renovation, and the beginning of a cycle, as in spring in the I Ching sequence of spring, growth, harvest, and trial. And Aries is the original cause of existence and of youthful pugnacity. It is the magician in the Tarot and Merlin in French, Merlin being a mythic figure that Jung had a very powerful identification with. Psychologically, it is related to juvenile, primitive ignorance with both creative and destructive fire, plus adventuresomeness. So Hermes incorporates many of these elements, as I discussed in my book, Hermes, Ecopsychology, and Complexity Theory. So the planet Mars is associated with the protection of warriors and is a star of violence and destruction, earthquakes, and storms. It is about determined will, energy, heat, radiation, action, and courage. It is also about extroversion, impulsive, ruthless, brutal, and even sexually violent action. So all these are amplifications of what we are dealing with the wild man energy that will be transmuted during the course of the fairy tale. So keep these associations in mind as we examine how this energy comes to manifest in deadly form in an individual and a culture. And ask yourself, if you had a wild man in your psyche, what would it look like and how might he act? Has he ever manifested in your life? What costume would you create if you could go to the famous Basel Fastnacht in Switzerland, disguised so well that nobody could identify you, to dress as your shadow energy, if you will? Would you wear a Darth Vader costume from Star Wars, for example? So our fairy tale is about how this energy is treated, what are the probable causes of it, and how this form of dark negredo energy is transformed into valuable gold. So the first response to this energy was to constrain it so it didn't do further harm. The wild man was bound in cords, and the king put it in an iron cage and forbade on the pain of death anybody to open it. The people were astonished to see it. It's like a culture getting a glimpse of its shadow side. The king locking the wild man up and putting the cage in the palace courtyard signifies suppression, conscious awareness of a problem, and attempting to control and constrain it. This is in contrast to repression, the unconscious control of the uncomfortable energy, as when entry into the forest was forbidden. So you can lock this energy up and try to hide it, but there's a lot of psychic energy then that you've locked away from yourself that, if you could relate to it, could be used for some powerful increase in your conscious abilities. So in my next lecture, I'll spend a whole lecture talking about the consequences of the key being under the queen's pillow. With the deadly force captive and constrained, people can re-enter the forest safely, i.e., life could go on, but about what cost, like I said, when so much vital energy is locked up. So here we have an image of distorted masculine energy, which we'll see at the end of the fairy tale. The king said he was bewitched. So we continue with the story. The king had a son of 8 years who was once playing in the courtyard, and while he was playing, his golden ball fell into the cage. The boy ran thither and said, "Give me my ball out." "Not till you have opened the door for me," answered the man. "No," said the boy, "I will not do that. The king has forbidden it," and ran away. The next day, he again went and asked for his ball. The wild man said, "Open the door," but the boy would not. On the third day, the king had ridden out hunting, and the boy went once more and said, "I cannot open the door even if I wished. I do not have the key." Then the wild man said, "It lies under your mother's pillow. You can get it there." The boy, who wanted his ball back, cast all thought to the winds and brought the key. So the door opened with difficulty, and the boy pinched his fingers. When it was open, the wild man stepped out, gave him the golden ball, and hurried away. The boy had become afraid, and he cried out, "O wild man, do not go away, or I shall be beaten." The wild man turned back, took him up, set him on his shoulder, and went with hasty steps into the forest. When the king came home, he observed the empty cage and asked the queen how that had happened. She knew nothing about it. She sought the key, but it was gone. She called the boy, but no one answered. The king sent out people to seek for him in the fields, but they did not find him. Then he could easily guess what had happened, and much grief reigned in the royal court. So there are many associations to the number 8, the metaphoric age of the boy. It's a number of regeneration, with 7 being completion, the 3 and the 4, and 8 being a new beginning that can be a spiritual rebirth. The octagon is between the circle and the square, associated with squaring the circle in alchemy, which is hexagram 1, the creative, in relation to hexagram 2, the receptive, manifesting and embodying the spirit in space and time while being inspired and guided by the spirit. 8 is in correspondence with the planet, you guessed it, Mars, and Scorpio in the zodiac, the constellation of sex, death, rebirth, pretty primal stuff. So the ball is a wonderful symbol of wholeness, like an embodied circle or a mandala in 3 dimensions. Gold is something of ultimate value, a metal signifying completion and incorruptibility in alchemy. So we enter life as a golden ball, like the innocence of youth expressed in hexagram 4, youth of a folly, and the ball gets distorted and loses its golden luster as we engage the vicissitudes of life, sometimes getting severely dented or nearly squeezed into non-existence. Cultures in different historical periods provide their distinct cultural warps to the ball. Consciously reclaiming the ball is the individuation process. So the ball rolling into the wild man's cage is what we call a fortunate accident. The self in the individual or culture surreptitiously impels change, which in this case by relating to the shadow. Again, we have a 3ness, a directness. The boy goes to the cage 3 times before a change occurs. It occurs when the king, as superego, if you will, is not on duty. He's away from the palace on a hunt. The boy acted impulsively when he cast all thought to the winds. Impulsiveness we associate with adolescents as they wrestle to find their independence. We can also associate it with getting overtaken by a complex. So the key is related to secrecy and discretion, and with forbidden knowledge and authority, and it's an attribute of Hecate in Greek mythology as a sacred psychopomp and as a guardian of Hades, the underworld. Persephone had the keys to the underworld, and Jung's Philemon, his spirit guide, appeared with a set of keys. So Hermes, worshipped as a phallus, was the only Greek god who could freely journey to and from the underworld. The king, as authority figure, forbade opening the cage, but the final arbiter for the release of the confinement of the wild man belonged to the queen. The queen is therefore intimately related to the wild man, with control of it being just beneath consciousness. The key was beneath her pillow where she sleeps on. So the boy hurt his finger upon opening the cage, with fingers being related to the creative force associated with the phallus, a symbol of male generativity. Examples are Tom Thumb and the dactyls in Greek myths that help Mother Earth birth Zeus, and to the gnomes and dwarfs in fairy tales and folklore. Another way of saying it is you get wounded, your consciousness gets wounded when you approach these powerful and dark unconscious energies, when you let them out of the cage. And this necessitates a coming to terms with it if one is to be healed and made whole. A person of our culture is forced into the liminal space between the judgments of the superego and collective values and the fearful but necessary task of engaging the shadow. College for many youths is that transitional space, and much shadow material with regards to sex and relationships gets played out in college. So the king searched for the boy in the fields, the cultivated and civilized space, but of course, he was not to be found there. So here we see a drawing of the boy holding his ball, being carried off by the wild man. In other words, his path to wholeness will have to be in relating to, coming to terms with what the wild man represents. So next time we will start with the many ways the feminine constrains and distorts the masculine energy and move towards what can be interpreted as male initiation. You can see this
Yeah.
is quite a different fairy tale from Cinderella. Like I said, I see Iron Hans as being quite a complementary fairy tale to Cinderella. So in Cinderella, we were dealing with Cinderella having to get in touch with archetypal, positive feminine energy. And here we're seeing in his tale that the movement with toward wholeness has to deal with coming to archetypal distorted masculine energy. And we'll see that it's how the key being under the queen's pillow has a role in distorting that energy. I just happened to notice in the comments that somebody said the Chinese word for king and it gives a symbol, and it's probably the only Chinese symbol I know because I've been so fascinated with the Chinese ideogram for the sage. One of the interpretations I got in my Zurich training was the ear listening to the inner king, and that's the king. In my understanding, in talking to one of the Chinese engineers here at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, said that the the top line is really a crown put on top of a warrior. So I think of it being like a warrior king. So here we have the element of battle and proving yourself in battle, and somebody who is really good at that, and a leader gets crowned as the leader of the. So that as the inner image for an inner component of the sage, again, is the importance of that yang energy to engage the world and tackle difficult things. That's the one way I think about it. And we'll see that is exactly what happens in this fairy tale. The prince will have to embody the wild man energy to become a great warrior and then be recognized as king, crowned as king. I never thought about that relationship before, but
Mm.
that's why I teach this course.
Okay, you're talking about this 8 years old boy. Does it relate to his stage of psychological development? Because it is a critical period of sexual initiation for boys. And also in the Chinese medicine textbook called Yellow Empath Classic um, Internal Medicine. That's
Mhm,
my translation.
mhm,
Um, the cycle of 8 has a very important meaning for men.
mhm. Wow. Yeah. If you could tell me about that either now or in an email, I'd love to hear it. Um, One thought I had when I was preparing the lecture for next week, I've already sent the lecture in, and you could imagine. I mean, it's difficult to imagine, but it's why these fairy tales are so relevant to what we know about psychology nowadays and trauma. You can imagine if you're 8 years old and you're exposed to really frightening, disturbing male energy, what a wound that would be to one's psyche. So that's one way of thinking about it in terms of development and trauma. And I'm curious about the 8. But again, just like in the I Ching, the archetypes of time relate to like something in a phase of development, personal development, a phase in a culture. And at my last lecture, I'll talk about how the wild man stories were popular at the stage in European history and evolution when so many people, as have happened in China, moved from rural areas to work in the cities. So they were losing that connection with nature and being out in the wilds, and they were in this urban polluted environment. So that's when the wild man stories and wild women stories became popular in a culture at a particular historical period. So if you could send me maybe a short paragraph about what 8 means in that Yellow Emperor, I would really appreciate it. I don't know if everybody in the group knows what it's about, but maybe to get us all on the same page, if you could distribute whatever you could come up with in a paragraph to the whole group. But I have the book of the Yellow Emperor in Chinese medicine. It's on my list of my top 500 books to read. So I don't know if I ever get to it, but it's something I've been very intrigued with.
Dennis, do you know cosplay, like Japanese anime? And in people who like Japanese anime, they just do
Mhm.
cosplay. They, kind of play the characters in those
Mhm.
animation. Okay.
Mhm.
So, nowadays cosplay is very popular in the whole world. Is it similar to this archetypal energy and this psychological symbolism and also this individual developmental stage that this fairy
Yeah.
tale
Nope.
brings us today?
I don't know enough about the Japanese system, but when you said it's very popular and throughout the world, that's almost by definition archetypal.
When you mention this distorted masculine energy, is it similar to this woman's masculine energy?
Um, yeah, yeah, very definitely. For the woman in Jungian terms, or more traditional Jungian terms, it would be like her animus, like a fearful animus, a rapist, a robber, a thief, uh, something frightening, even sexually threatening, and so on. That's how one of some of the ways it would appear in a woman's psyche.
Uh,
In the distorted form, in the wild man form. Yep. And then what's important there, like if that energy is really fearful to a woman, the fact that the key to containing that is controlled by a woman, then if that control is too constrictive, then it's going to distort the energies in the masculine realm. And the most lived human experience of that is, if you will, of mothers that are fearful of the masculine and how constrictive they can be on their sons. So I will give an example. I'll try to squeeze in a more detailed example next time, but just quickly this time from another case. I worked with a fellow for several years. The situation was that his father was alcoholic and could get very angry. So his wife, my Allison's mother, really would constrict any expression of anger by her son. And that inability for him to get in touch with his anger was something that was with him in his 40s and 50s when I was working with him.
in relates to the word Wang, king, or the inner king,
Mhm.
um, the, the part underneath is not warrior, a soldier, it is the earth. So in the outside world, the king is the person who in charge of this earth or in charge of this field. That is the probable explanation for this word.
Oh,
And if we are talking about the inner quality, um, this king or this Wang is the person who can understand three elements: the heaven, earth, and person or the individual. That's the person who can be the king. So in the word of Wang, it has those three elements.
excellent. I love that.
the yellow ampere. So it's the actually 7 and 8, because for the woman, the cycle is 7, and 7 and 8 are from 素问, is part, like the question, part from this yellow ampere. And 上古天真论, it is the first chapter of this book. So you can find this 7 and 8 from the first chapter of this book. And it's about the discussion of this primal or primitive heaven, things like that. That's the general translation of that. Is this distorted masculine energy relate to the father complex?
Yeah, I will go into that next time. It's really both. The example that I use, really what they are going to in some detail is the case that I presented, the first case I presented at the 13th Sandplay Conference in China. And that's a perfect example of a really domineering mother and a weak father. So it's really a combination of the two. There's not enough masculine energy and not enough strength in the masculine realm, the yang realm, if you will. And the young boy can get overwhelmed by this feminine. And like I said, if you have, I'm sure you have the recording. If you wanted to, you could look at it before the next lecture, but I will be focusing more on how the positive and negative feminine energy. But the whole lecture this week will be about the pillow, the key being under the mother's pillow, just that one element. So
Thank you.
again, sticking to the image, as Hillman liked to do, and sticking to the particulars, and that image of those beads tied together by a string, the particular here of how the masculine, of the distortion of the masculine energy is related to the key being under the queen's pillow. So it's the role that has to do in distorting the masculine energy. It's that particular way of distorting the masculine energy. That's what we're focusing on in this fairy tale.
Yep.
So your homework can be thinking about how wild man energy has appeared in your psyches, or maybe in the clients that you've worked with, or how it has appeared in your culture and your Chinese cultural myths. Is pretty distinct in our Western culture where the wild man energy has come in, but that's the beauty of archetypes. Yeah, you have to translate it and see how it manifests in your culture, and also consider it at different periods in time of your cultural history.
Yes,
I'll just say one last thing. I trained in Switzerland, and I did go to the Basel Fastnacht. And I was thinking, boy, if I could be completely disguised like a lot of people are, and even disguise your voice so nobody would see. And I thought, how would I go with my shadow side? And I immediately got an image, and I thought, oh my God, that's my shadow. Of course, I wouldn't tell you what it was. You never tell people what your shadow are. They can figure it out if they're around you enough. But those images are so powerful. So see what kind of images come up for you if you could dress as your shadow at the Basel Fastnacht. Good night, I guess. Good morning to you, and I'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you. See you next week, Dennis. Bye bye.
Take care. 谢谢。
他祝大家一个美好的早晨，然后我们也祝他一个美好的夜晚。Thank you. Bye bye, Dennis. See you next time. Bye.